November 12, 1942, the sun hung low over the Tunisian hills, casting long shadows across the sand-stained wreckage of what had been, only hours before, a German mechanized column. The air still carried the bitter tang of cordite and burning rubber. Hauptmann Ernst Hoffmann moved through the debris field with the mechanical precision of a man who had witnessed too much death, his boots crunching over spent shell casings that glittered like brass coins in the fading light. He paused beside the hulk of a Panzer Roman III, its turret torn open, as though some giant hand had peeled back the steel like the lid of a sardine can. The metal edges were not scorched by fire or fragmented by explosive force, but punctured, repeatedly, methodically, with holes the size of a man's thumb, each one speaking to a violence both precise and overwhelming. Hoffmann had fought across Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. He had faced the desperate charges of Polish cavalry, the disciplined resistance of French infantry, and the seemingly inexhaustible waves of Soviet soldiers who fought with a ferocity born of desperation and ideology. But this was different. This was not the random chaos of battle or the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front. This was something methodical, something industrial, something that spoke to a kind of warfare the Wehrmacht had not fully anticipated. As he knelt beside the shattered tank, running his gloved fingers over the perforated armor, he understood with absolute clarity that they were facing an enemy whose approach to war was fundamentally different from their own. The Americans had arrived in North Africa, and with them, they had brought a weapon that would come to symbolize everything the German soldier would learn to fear about American combat doctrine: the M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine gun. The weight of history. To understand the German soldier's relationship with the M2, one must first understand the context in which these two military forces met. The Wehrmacht of 1942 was an army that had conquered nearly all of continental Europe through a combination of tactical brilliance, operational daring, and technological innovation. German soldiers carried with them not merely weapons, but a sense of martial superiority cultivated through years of victory. The MG-34 and its successor, the MG-42, were considered the finest machine guns in the world, weapons that could soar through infantry formations with cyclic rates approaching 1,200 rounds per minute. German military doctrine emphasized precision, discipline, and the efficiency of well-trained soldiers employing superior tactics. The American military machine that began landing in North Africa in late 1942 represented something entirely different. The United States had entered the war with an industrial capacity that dwarfed that of any other nation, and while American soldiers were initially inexperienced and sometimes poorly coordinated in their first engagements, they brought with them quantities of equipment that seemed to German eyes almost obscene in their abundance. American units were not merely well supplied, they were oversupplied, equipped with a redundancy of firepower that violated every principle of military economy the Germans had been taught to value. The M2 Browning, designed by John Moses Browning in the aftermath of World War I, and refined throughout the 1920s and 1930s, was not technically a new weapon by 1942. What made it remarkable was not innovation but implementation, the sheer scale at which the Americans deployed it, and the tactical philosophy that deployment represented. Where German doctrine typically allocated machine guns at the squad or platoon level, creating centers of firepower around which infantry maneuvered, the Americans seemed to mount 50 caliber machine guns on everything. They appeared on jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, aircraft, landing craft, and fixed defensive positions. They were used not as precious, carefully positioned assets, but as general-purpose tools, employed with a casualness that suggested infinite supply. The mechanical reality: the M2 fired a cartridge that measured 12.7 millimeters in diameter and 99 millimeters in length, a round originally designed for anti-tank purposes in World War I. By World War II, tank armor had advanced far beyond what the .50 caliber could penetrate directly, but the round retained devastating effectiveness against virtually everything else on the battlefield. The standard ball ammunition could penetrate 23 millimeters of armor plate at 500 meters, more than sufficient to defeat the armor of half-tracks, armored cars, and light tanks. Armor-piercing rounds could punch through 34 millimeters at the same range. The projectile left the barrel at approximately 900 meters per second, carrying kinetic energy sufficient to tear through engine blocks, shatter observation equipment, and reduce cover that would stop rifle fire to splinters and dust. German after-action reports from the North African campaign reveal a growing obsession with this weapon. A report from Panzerarmee Africa, dated February 1943, notes with clinical precision that American .50 caliber machine guns had successfully engaged and destroyed or disabled 17 light armored vehicles at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters during a 3-day period. The report's author observes that German vehicles, particularly the SDKFC 222 and 223 armored cars that formed the reconnaissance screen for armored units, were unacceptably vulnerable to American heavy machine gun fire at ranges where German return fire was largely ineffective. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, a reconnaissance officer with the 21st Panzer Division, recorded in his diary an engagement near Kasserine Pass in February 1943. We observed the American column from a distance of perhaps 800 meters, preparing to execute a flanking maneuver. Before we could close to effective range, their vehicles, I counted at least 6 mounted with the heavy machine guns, opened fire simultaneously. The sound was distinctive, slower than our own machine guns, a methodical hammering that seemed to come from all directions at once. Lieutenant Becker's vehicle was struck first. I saw the tracers arcing toward us like strings of fire, moving almost lazily until they arrived with devastating effect. The armor offered no protection. The rounds penetrated one side and exited the other. Becker was killed instantly, along with his crew. We withdrew before we could even return effective fire. The psychology of technological inadequacy, the German military mind, shaped by decades of Prussian military tradition, valued efficiency, skill, and the moral quality of the soldier. There was a philosophical component to German military thinking that emphasized the superiority of the well-trained individual soldier over mere material abundance. This ideology had served the Wehrmacht well in the early years of the war, when German soldiers, despite sometimes being outnumbered and outgunned, achieved victory through superior tactics and operational execution. The encounter with American firepower in general, and the M2 in particular, challenged this ideology at its foundation. German soldiers had expected the Americans to be soft, undisciplined, reliant on material superiority, because they lacked the martial virtues of European soldiers hardened by centuries of warfare. What they discovered instead was that material superiority, when applied with systematic thoroughness, could overwhelm even the most skilled and disciplined troops. The M2 became a symbol of this realization, a weapon that did not require exceptional skill to employ effectively, but which, in the hands of even moderately trained soldiers, could dominate the battlefield through sheer destructive potential. Oberst Heinrich Brandt, a staff officer who served in Tunisia and later in Italy, wrote in his memoirs published in the 1950s, "We had been taught that the Americans were materially rich but spiritually poor, that they lacked the warrior spirit necessary for sustained combat. This was a comforting delusion that did not survive contact with reality. The Americans did indeed have material abundance. They had so much equipment that they could afford to employ heavy machine guns in roles we would have considered wasteful. But this was not weakness. It was a different conception of warfare entirely. They did not seek to defeat us through superior individual skill or tactical cleverness. They sought to overwhelm us through the systematic application of firepower that made skill and cleverness irrelevant." The psychological impact of facing the M2 was magnified by several factors. First, the weapon's effective range meant that German units often came under fire before they could effectively return it. German squad automatic weapons, primarily the MG-34 and MG-42, were devastating at ranges up to 1,000 meters, but they fired a 7.92mm cartridge that, while lethal to personnel, could not effectively penetrate armored vehicles or substantial cover. The M2, mounted on vehicles, provided American units with mobile firepower that could engage German positions from ranges where the Germans could not effectively respond. Second, the M2's ammunition load and sustained fire capability meant that American units could maintain suppressive fire for extended periods. A vehicle-mounted M2 typically carried several hundred rounds in belts, with additional ammunition readily available. German forces, fighting at the end of extended supply lines, had learned to husband their ammunition carefully. The casual expenditure of hundreds of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition in brief engagements seemed to German observers both tactically profligate and strategically impossible. Yet the Americans did it routinely, suggesting reserves of material that made German supply concerns seem quaint. The evidence accumulates as the war progressed through Sicily, Italy, and eventually Northwest Europe. German military reports documented an evolving respect for and fear of the M2, a tactical study produced by the German Army High Command in late 1943, based on lessons from the Mediterranean theater, devoted an entire section to American heavy machine gun employment. The document notes that American forces used .50 caliber machine guns in a manner inconsistent with European military practice, mounting them in numbers that suggest either reckless disregard for logistical constraints or access to unlimited ammunition supplies. The psychological effect on our troops of sustained heavy machine gun fire, particularly when combined with artillery and air support, has proven significant. The document goes on to recommend that German units avoid engagement with American mechanized forces at ranges beyond 500 meters when possible, acknowledging implicitly that at longer ranges, the Americans held a significant advantage in mobile firepower. This was a remarkable admission for an army that prided itself on tactical flexibility and offensive spirit, a tacit acknowledgement that the material realities of American firepower sometimes necessitated defensive or evasive tactics. In Normandy, German soldiers defending against the Allied invasion encountered the M2 in overwhelming numbers. American forces had mounted .50 caliber machine guns on virtually every vehicle that could accommodate one. Landing craft approaching the beaches were equipped with multiple M2s for suppressive fire. Tanks carried them as commanders' weapons. Half-tracks bristled with them. Jeeps mounted them on pedestals. The cumulative effect was to create a moving wall of heavy machine gun fire that advanced with American mechanized units. Oberleutnant Gustav Fischer, defending a position near Saint-Lô in June 1944, described the experience in a letter to his family that was intercepted by Allied intelligence. They come not with elegance or tactical subtlety, but with overwhelming force. The heavy machine guns fire continuously, not in short bursts to conserve ammunition as we do, but in long, sustained strings of fire that tear apart anything they touch. Our positions, which would stop rifle fire and even light machine gun fire, are reduced to splinters by the heavy bullets. The noise alone is maddening, not the high-speed scream of our own machine guns, but a deeper, heavier sound, like enormous hammers striking again and again. One can hear individual rounds impacting, each one carrying enough energy to kill or maim. We cannot move during the day. We cannot repair positions. We can only shelter in the deepest holes and pray that the next burst passes overhead. The symbolic burden for German soldiers, the M2 came to represent something beyond its tactical capabilities. It became a symbol of American abundance, of an enemy who could afford to employ weapons of devastating power with casual frequency, who could expend ammunition in quantities that seemed impossible, who could replace equipment losses overnight, while German units scraped by with aging equipment and dwindling supplies. The psychological burden of this realization was profound. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, as German forces retreated across France and back into the Reich itself, the M2 remained a constant presence in combat reports. It destroyed vehicles, suppressed infantry, tore through defensive positions, and killed with mechanical indifference. But beyond its physical effects, it served as a daily reminder that Germany was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity so vastly exceeded its own that the war's outcome was, in material terms, inevitable. Jeffreiter Hans Möller, a machine gunner who fought from Normandy to the Ruhr Parket, recalled in a post-war interview, "We had the finest machine guns in the world. I still believe this." The MG-42 was a masterpiece of engineering, reliable, deadly, efficient. But what good is efficiency when the enemy has overwhelming abundance? We counted our ammunition in belts and worried about resupply. The Americans fired their heavy machine guns as though ammunition cost nothing. Perhaps for them it did not. I remember thinking, as we fell back through France, that we were not being defeated by better soldiers or better tactics. We were being buried under an avalanche of steel and explosives, and the American heavy machine gun was the sound of that avalanche. The M2 also represented a philosophical challenge to German military ideology. German doctrine emphasized the primacy of the trained soldier, the individual warrior whose skill and discipline were the foundation of military power. The Americans, with their heavy machine guns mounted on every vehicle, their willingness to expend enormous quantities of ammunition, their reliance on firepower over finesse, seemed to embody a different philosophy entirely. That industrial might, properly organized and applied, could overcome individual skill. That quantity, pushed to sufficient extremes, acquired a quality of its own. This was a bitter revelation for German soldiers who had been raised on notions of military excellence and martial virtue. The M2, more than perhaps any other weapon, forced a recognition that in modern industrial warfare, ideology and individual skill mattered less than the capacity to produce and deploy overwhelming material force. The transformation of understanding by early 1945, with German forces retreating on all fronts and the Reich itself under invasion, the perspective of German soldiers regarding the M2 and American military capability had undergone a complete transformation. Early war dismissals of American military prowess had given way to a grudging respect and a weary acceptance of material reality. The M2 was no longer merely a weapon to be feared tactically. It had become emblematic of the fundamental mismatch between German and American war-making capacity. Major Franz Becker, a staff officer captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, told his interrogators, "We understood, perhaps by late 1943, that we could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with American industrial capacity. But understanding intellectually is different from experiencing it day after day on the battlefield. The heavy machine guns, they were everywhere, firing constantly, never silent. It was not that each individual weapon was so extraordinary, though they were certainly effective. It was that there were so many of them, always supplied, always operational, always firing. They represented something we could not match, the ability to maintain overwhelming firepower continuously across every sector of the front without apparent concern for ammunition expenditure or equipment loss. German tactical manuals from the war's final months reveal the extent to which the M2 had become ingrained in German tactical thinking. Documents from early 1945 instruct soldiers to identify and prioritize the elimination of American heavy machine gun positions, noting that their removal significantly degraded American defensive capability. But the same documents acknowledge, with an almost fatalistic tone, that destroying individual M2 positions rarely provided lasting advantage, as the Americans could replace both weapons and crews with what seemed like inexhaustible rapidity. The arithmetic of destruction, the statistical record, supports German soldiers' subjective experiences. American production figures for the M2 Browning during World War II exceeded 100,000 units. Ammunition production for the .50 caliber cartridge numbered in the billions of rounds. This level of production enabled the Americans to employ the weapon in ways that would have been logistically impossible for any other combatant nation. Where other armies carefully allocated heavy machine guns to specific units and roles, the Americans distributed them with abandon, mounting them wherever they might prove useful. German forces, by contrast, faced increasingly severe shortages of all equipment types as the war progressed. Ammunition was rationed, fuel became scarce, replacement vehicles and weapons were delayed or never arrived. The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance was stark, and nowhere was it more apparent than in the employment of heavy machine guns. German forces had heavy machine guns, the MG-34 and MG-42 on heavy mounts, various anti-aircraft weapons, but they could not employ them with the same profligacy as the Americans because they lacked both the weapons themselves and the ammunition to feed them in such quantities. This disparity manifested in numerous small ways that, cumulatively, had enormous tactical implications. American units could afford to use .50 caliber machine guns for suppressive fire during assaults, expending hundreds or thousands of rounds to pin down German positions while infantry maneuvered. They could mount multiple M2s on vehicles, creating mobile strongpoints of devastating firepower. They could employ the weapons in anti-aircraft roles, in anti-vehicular roles, and in general infantry support roles simultaneously, because they had sufficient numbers to dedicate weapons to specific purposes without creating shortages elsewhere. German units, facing shortages of everything, had to make hard choices about weapons allocation and ammunition expenditure. A machine gun used for suppressive fire was a machine gun not available for defensive positions. Ammunition expended in one engagement meant less available for the next. These constraints forced German tactical thinking into increasingly defensive postures, not because German soldiers lacked offensive spirit, but because the material balance made offensive operations increasingly costly and often futile. The sound of industrial power veterans of combat against American forces consistently mention the distinctive sound of the M2, a slower, heavier cadence than the high-pitched scream of German machine guns. The MG42, with its cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute or more, produced a sound often described as resembling tearing cloth, each burst blending into a continuous roar. The M2, firing at approximately 500 rounds per minute, produced individual, distinguishable impacts, a methodical hammering that carried a different psychological weight. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Werner, who fought in the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, described the auditory landscape of battle. During our initial assault, we heard very little American heavy machine gun fire. We had achieved surprise, and many of their positions were overrun before they could effectively respond. But when their reinforcements arrived, everything changed. The sound of those heavy machine guns, coming from multiple directions, was unlike anything else on the battlefield. You could hear individual rounds striking, each impact distinct, and knowing that each of those rounds carried enough force to penetrate our vehicles or tear through cover was terrifying. When the American counterattack came, it was preceded by that sound, those heavy hammering impacts getting closer, accompanied by artillery and the roar of their tanks. We had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, but we lacked the resources to exploit it, and they responded with overwhelming material force. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, illustrated with brutal clarity the gulf between German and American material capabilities. German forces, scraped together from depleted units and equipped with carefully hoarded fuel and ammunition reserves, achieved impressive initial gains through surprise and desperate courage. But American forces responded with crushing firepower, including massive employment of 50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles in defensive positions and used for both ground and air defense. The offensive ground to a halt not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because American material superiority made sustained offensive operations impossible. The democracy of destructive power. There was another dimension to German soldiers' relationship with the M2 that touched on ideology and worldview. The Americans, with their emphasis on industrial production and material abundance, represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that did not place the individual soldier on a pedestal, but rather treated soldiers as components of a vast industrial system. The M2 as a weapon reflected this philosophy. It did not require years of training to employ effectively. It was mechanically simple, reliable, and could be operated by soldiers with relatively modest amounts of training. Its effectiveness came not from the individual operator's skill, but from the weapon's inherent characteristics and the abundance of ammunition available to feed it. This stood in sharp contrast to German military philosophy, which emphasized the cultivation of elite soldiers through rigorous training and selection. German soldiers were taught that their superiority lay in their individual quality as warriors, in their discipline and skill. The Americans, with their industrial approach to warfare, implicitly rejected this notion. They could take civilians, give them modest training, equip them with overwhelming quantities of excellent equipment, and produce military units that could defeat even highly trained opponents through sheer material advantage. For German soldiers raised on ideologies of martial superiority and racial hierarchy, this was a deeply unsettling realization. The Americans were defeating them not through individual superiority, though by war's end, American soldiers were certainly well trained and experienced, but through superior organization, industrial capacity, and a willingness to apply material resources on a scale that made individual skill less relevant. Hauptmann Otto Schneider, captured in the Huitjen forest in late 1944, reflected on this in captivity. We were told that we were the master race, that our soldiers were superior in every way, that our victories proved the righteousness of our cause. But facing the Americans taught us different lessons. They were not superhuman. Many of them were not even professional soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, students, but they had equipment in quantities we could not imagine, and they used it without hesitation or restraint. Their heavy machine guns, they symbolized this perfectly. The weapons themselves were effective, but not miraculous. What made them devastating was that they were everywhere, always supplied, supported by an industrial system that could replace any losses immediately. We were not defeated by better men. We were defeated by better organization and infinitely greater resources. The final recognition by the war's end, the German military's institutional knowledge had fully incorporated the lessons of facing American firepower. Captured tactical documents from early 1945 show detailed understanding of American weapons and their employment, including extensive discussion of the M2 and tactics for negating its advantages. But these documents also reveal a fatalistic tone. The suggestions offered are primarily defensive, focused on survival rather than victory, acknowledging implicitly that German forces lacked the means to contest American material superiority effectively. The M2 Browning continued in American service long after World War II ended, seeing action in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent American military conflict through the present day. Its longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of its design. John Browning's creation proved robust, reliable, and effective across decades of technological change. But its historical significance extends beyond its technical merits. During World War II, it became symbolic of American military capability, a physical manifestation of industrial might applied to warfare. For the German soldiers who faced it, the M2 represented the moment when their ideologies of martial superiority confronted the reality of industrial warfare. It was the sound of their assumptions being torn apart, the physical proof that courage and skill, however genuine, could not overcome fundamental disparities in material resources. It was a weapon, certainly, a highly effective one, but it was also an education, teaching with brutal clarity that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and organizational effectiveness could matter more than individual warrior qualities. Epilogue: the weight of metal and meaning, the desert sun has set over those Tunisian hills, where Hauptmann Hoffmann walked among the shattered tanks 7 decades ago. The brass shell casings have long since been collected or buried by shifting sand. The men who fought there, German and American alike, have mostly passed from this world, taking with them their immediate memories of fear and courage, of overwhelming firepower and desperate resistance. But the lessons remain, encoded in after-action reports and tactical manuals, in letters home and post-war memoirs, in the institutional knowledge of armies that learned what industrial warfare truly meant. The M2 Browning was not the only weapon that taught these lessons, nor even the most destructive. American artillery, armor, and air power all contributed to the material avalanche that buried German military ambitions. But the M2, perhaps because of its ubiquity, perhaps because of the distinctive sound of its fire, perhaps because it was intimate in scale, visible, identifiable, personal in a way that artillery and bombs were not, became fixed in German military consciousness as the symbol of what they faced. It represented a kind of warfare that valued abundance over scarcity, firepower over finesse, industrial might over individual skill. It embodied a nation that could afford to mount heavy machine guns on jeeps, that could expend ammunition with casual abandon, that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. To German soldiers raised on notions of efficiency and the supremacy of the well-trained warrior, this was a profound intellectual and psychological challenge. They were being defeated not because they lacked courage or skill. German soldiers fought with desperate bravery to the very end, but because courage and skill proved insufficient against an enemy whose approach to warfare was fundamentally different from anything their military tradition had prepared them to face. The despising of the M2, documented in countless reports and memoirs, was thus not hatred of a particular weapon, but something deeper, a recognition that they were confronting a way of war they could not match, fighting an enemy whose resources rendered traditional military virtues less relevant. It was the slow, bitter realization that ideology and will, however fierce, could not overcome industrial reality, that a nation which could produce and deploy 50-caliber machine guns in seemingly infinite numbers was not vulnerable to defeat through superior tactics or fighting spirit alone. In the end, the M2 Browning was more than steel and springs, more than a mechanism for converting ammunition into suppressive fire. It was a messenger delivering news that the German military establishment did not wish to hear, that they were overmatched, that the war could not be won, that all the courage and sacrifice of individual soldiers could not alter the fundamental arithmetic of industrial capacity. It was the sound of inevitability, hammering away at defenses both physical and psychological, teaching with each burst of fire that the age of warfare they had mastered was ending, replaced by something larger, more mechanical, more relentlessly industrial than anything Prussian military tradition had conceived. The German soldiers who faced the M2 and survived learned to respect it, to fear it, and finally to despise it, not for what it was, but for what it represented. It was the sound of their own assumptions collapsing, the physical manifestation of a truth they could not escape, that in total war between industrial nations, material abundance wielded with systematic thoroughness could overwhelm any amount of tactical skill or ideological fervor. The heavy, methodical hammering of the M2 was the sound of that truth being driven home, round by round, burst by burst, until there was no longer any refuge in comforting delusions about martial superiority or the primacy of the warrior spirit. That sound echoed across the battlefields of North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany itself, a constant reminder that war had changed, that the calculus of combat had shifted irrevocably toward those who could produce and sustain overwhelming firepower. For German soldiers, the M2 was not merely feared, it was despised because it made their finest qualities irrelevant, because it reduced battles they had expected to win through skill to material contests they could not help but lose, because it was the voice of American industrial might speaking in the only language that war understands, the language of applied force delivered with inexhaustible consistency until resistance became futile and defeat became inevitable. In the hammering of the M2, German soldiers heard the sound of the future, mechanical, abundant, impersonal, and utterly overwhelming. They despised it because they could not answer it, could not match it, could not escape the truth it told about the war they were losing and the world that was ending around them. And in that despising was the recognition, bitter and complete, that courage alone is not enough, that skill without resources is futile, that in the arithmetic of industrial warfare, the side with more metal, more fire, and more will to expend both had already won. The M2 Browning machine gun, despised by those who faced it, stands now as a monument not merely to American military technology, but to the transformation of warfare itself, from a contest of warriors to a collision of industrial systems, from the poetry of tactical excellence to the prose of material overwhelming. The German soldiers who hated it understood, perhaps better than they wished, that they were witnessing not merely their own defeat, but the end of an era in which the qualities they valued most, courage, discipline, tactical skill, could determine the outcome of wars. The heavy machine gun hammering away at their positions was teaching the final, hardest lesson, that in modern warfare, abundance trumps excellence, that production capacity matters more than warrior spirit, and that the nation which can afford to mount 50 caliber machine guns on every vehicle has already written the conclusion to the story, no matter how bravely or skillfully the other side fights. That is why they despised it, not for what it did, but for what it meant.